Mysteries and Lessons from Numbers, Israel's Journey to the Promised Land. Did you know that the book of Numbers in the Bible hides powerful lessons and mysteries that can change the way we view our faith? Today, we're going to explore some of the most intriguing events in the journey of the people of Israel. But before we begin, subscribe to the channel and activate the bell, because what you'll see in this video will surprise you. And this is just the beginning. The first census of Israel, Numbers 1 to 4. At the beginning of the book of Numbers, God orders Moses to conduct a census of the people of Israel, registering the men 20 years old and older who were fit for war. Numbers 1 to 4. This census was essential for the organization of the nation, both militarily and socially, preparing them for the conquest of the Promised Land. The census had several functions. Military preparation. Since Israel was about to face several hostile nations, it was necessary to know how many men were fit for war. Camp organization. God established an orderly structure for the camp around the tabernacle, ensuring discipline and order. Confirmation of God's promise. The growth of the people of Israel, now with more than 600,000 men, evidence fulfillment of the promise made to Abraham that his descendants would be numerous. Genesis 15:5. Distribution of the land. The census would also assist in the future division of the land of Canaan, based on the population of each tribe. Numbers 26:52 to 56. The total number of men fit for war was 603,550. Numbers 1:46, excluding women, children, and the elderly. The count was done tribe by tribe, except for the Levites, who had a special function. Unlike the other tribes, the Levites were not counted in the military census. God separated them for service in the tabernacle, being responsible for caring for and transporting the sacred objects. They were organized into 3 clans, each with a specific function. The Gershonites, responsible for the curtains and coverings of the tabernacle. The Kohathites transported the most sacred objects, such as the Ark of the Covenant and the altar of incense. And the Merarites, responsible for the structures of the tabernacle, such as the boards, columns, and bases. Only the descendants of Aaron, within the tribe of Levi, could exercise the priesthood. This distinction reinforced the importance of worship and the presence of God among the people. The camp was organized strategically, Numbers 2, with the tabernacle in the center, representing that God should be the focus and priority of the nation. The tribes were divided into 4 groups, each camped around the tabernacle. On the east side, Judah, Issachar, and Zebulun. On the south side, Reuben, Simeon, and Gad. On the west side, Ephraim, Manasseh, and Benjamin. And on the north side, Dan, Asher, and Naphtali. The Levites camped around the tabernacle to protect and serve it. The census was not just an administrative act, but a declaration of Israel's identity and purpose. It showed that God is at the center of the people's lives. The tabernacle was placed in the middle of the camp, symbolizing his constant presence. Each person has an important role. Each tribe had a specific function in the community, demonstrating divine order and purpose. And obedience is essential. Israel's success depended on following God's directions, both in organization and in spiritual life. This first census prepared Israel for the journey to Canaan, demonstrating God's sovereignty over his people and the need for trust and obedience to him. Laws and regulations, Numbers 5 to 10. God established laws and regulations that would guarantee the purity of the people, the holiness of the priesthood, and order in worship and religious service. These commandments ensured that Israel would remain spiritually pure and obedient during their journey through the wilderness. God commanded that unclean people be removed from the camp in order to preserve the holiness of the community. The following were considered unclean: lepers and people with contagious diseases, people who had contact with dead bodies, and those with impure bodily discharges. The removal was not a punishment, but a measure of holiness and public health, ensuring that Israel remained pure before God. If an Israelite committed a sin against another person, he was to confess his sin, make restitution for damage caused, paying the original amount plus 20% compensation, and offer a sacrifice for sin. This emphasized that disobedience affects not only the sinner and God, but also the community, reinforcing the importance of justice and social responsibility. If a man suspected his wife of being unfaithful but had no proof, he would take her to the priest for a ritual test. The woman was to drink bitter water, mixed with dust from the tabernacle. If she was guilty, she would suffer physical consequences. If she was innocent, nothing would happen. This ritual protected women from false accusations. Since the judgment was made by God, it demonstrated that God is the final judge and not just the word of a man. And it highlighted the importance of fidelity in marriage, preserving the sanctity of the Israelite family. The Nazirite vow was a special commitment of total dedication to God. Whoever took it should, first, not cut their hair, a symbol of consecration. Second, not drink wine or any fermented drink. It represented separation from the world. Third, not touch corpses. It avoided impurity. The vow could be temporary or for life, like Samson, Samuel, and John the Baptist. It expressed a desire for greater holiness and commitment to God. God instructed Aaron and his sons to bless Israel with these words: "The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace." Numbers 6, 24-26. This blessing was a sign of divine favor, assuring protection, grace, and peace for the people. The Levites were consecrated to serve in the tabernacle in place of the firstborn of Israel. The process included, first, purification with water and sacrifices. Second, the laying on of hands by the people, transferring them to God's service. Third, substitution of the firstborn, symbolizing the nation's redemption. This ceremony showed that the Levites were set apart for God and would play a vital role in the worship and maintenance of the tabernacle. God commanded that the Passover be celebrated annually, even in the wilderness. Those who were ritually unclean or away from the camp could celebrate it the following month. This showed that communion with God was accessible to all and that God valued obedience and a sincere desire to worship him. God guided Israel by means of cloud during the day and a pillar of fire at night. The people only moved when the cloud lifted. This symbolized God's constant presence, the need to depend on him for guidance, total obedience. Israel could not act on its own. The departure from Sinai and the rebellion of the people, Numbers 10-12. The Israelites leave Mount Sinai after receiving instructions from God on how to organize the camp and how to move when the cloud of God's presence lifted. They are guided by a cloud that indicates when to stop and when to move on. God's command to people is clear and precise, and they follow Moses' instructions. The chapter also reports the use of trumpets to call an assembly, to warn of the beginning of the journey, or to signal war. Soon after leaving Mount Sinai, the people begin to complain and murmur. They complain about the hardships of the journey and especially the lack of food. They miss the food of Egypt, such as fish, cucumbers, watermelons, garlic, and onions. This feeling of nostalgia for life in Egypt leads to widespread dissatisfaction, demonstrating a disdain for the blessings that God had given them until then, such as the manna that fell from the sky as food. God, upon hearing the people's murmurings, becomes angry and decides to punish the nation. He sends fire that consumes parts of the camp, causing great suffering. When the people repent and ask Moses to intercede, he prays to God and the fire is put out. In addition, Moses also complains to God, saying that he can no longer bear the responsibility of leading this rebellious people. He questions how he can carry such a burden alone. God responds by telling Moses to choose 70 elders from the people, to whom he will grant part of the spirit that was upon Moses, so that they can help him lead. Another rebellion, this time within Moses' own family. Miriam and Aaron, Moses' siblings, begin to question his authority and leadership, possibly out of envy, since Moses married a Cushite woman, a marriage that could be seen as out of norm for time. They wonder why Moses sets himself up as the sole leader, suggesting that God also speaks to them. God responds to this rebellion by calling Moses, Aaron, and Miriam to the tent of meeting, and then declaring that Moses was the most faithful of prophets and that God communicated directly with him, clearly, and not through visions or riddles, as he did with the others. As punishment, Miriam is afflicted with leprosy for 7 days and is excluded from the camp. Moses then intercedes for his sister, and God heals her after that period. The spies in Canaan and the rebellion of the people, Numbers 13-14. God commands Moses to send a group of 12 spies, one from each tribe of Israel, to explore the land of Canaan, the promised land. The mission of the spies is to examine the land, its cities, the type of people living there, and the general conditions. They are to return with a report on what they have found so that the people can prepare for conquest. The spies spend 40 days in Canaan and, upon their return, bring back fruits of the land, such as grapes, figs, and pomegranates, to show the abundance of the land. They report that, in fact, the land is rich and fertile, flowing with milk and honey, as God had promised. However, 10 of the spies, led by men such as Caleb and Joshua, give a negative report, saying that the land is inhabited by giants and that the cities are fortified and powerful. They describe the inhabitants of Canaan as giants and feel like locusts before them, instilling fear in the people. The negative report of the 10 spies causes great panic among the people of Israel. The people begin to murmur against Moses and Aaron, questioning why they left Egypt. If they were not to die in the desert, they preferred to return to Egypt rather than face the dangers of the promised land. Fear takes hold of everyone, and they even consider choosing another leader to guide them back to Egypt. However, 2 spies, Joshua and Caleb, oppose this negative view. They try to encourage the people, saying that the land is good and that God is with them and will certainly help them conquer the land. But the crowd ignores the words of Joshua and Caleb, and panic spreads. The people refuse to trust God's promises and rebel, want to stone Joshua and Caleb. In the face of this unbelief and rebellion, God becomes angry with the people and threatens to destroy them. But Moses intercedes on their behalf, asking God not to destroy the nation. God then decides that because of their lack of faith and rebellion, that generation of Israelites will not enter the promised land. The punishment is a 40-year sentence in the desert, 1 year for each day that the spies spent exploring the land. God also decrees that the 10 spies who brought the negative report will die of plague, while Joshua and Caleb, because of their faithfulness, will be the only ones to enter the promised land of their generation. The people are then forced to wander in the desert again, awaiting the death of this unbelieving generation before they can enter the land. The rebellion described in Numbers 13 and 14 has several important lessons. Lack of faith. Despite all the wonders God had already performed to free Israel from Egypt and care for them in the desert, the people demonstrated a lack of faith in their ability to conquer the promised land. Consequences of unbelief. The people's unbelief results in a severe punishment. 40 years of wandering the desert, an entire generation dying without seeing the promised land. The faithfulness of Joshua and Caleb. Only Joshua and Caleb trusted God and believed that he could deliver the land to them. Their faith and courage stand out in a time of great despair, and God rewards them for their faithfulness. Moses' leadership. Moses also plays a crucial role in this episode, interceding for his people and asking God to have mercy on Israel, which demonstrates his heart as a shepherd and leader. In short, the mission of the spies in Canaan and the subsequent rebellion of the people are defining moments in Israel's journey. This episode highlights the dangers of lack of faith and the importance of trusting in God's promises, even when the challenges seem insurmountable. Are you beginning to understand what's behind this story? Each chapter of the book of Numbers reveals fascinating secrets about faith, leadership, and obedience. If you're wondering what happens next, don't leave now. Share with your friends and stay with us to unravel even more mysteries that will leave you with more questions and answers at the same time. Laws and Judgments, Numbers 15 to 19. Numbers chapters 15 through 19 present various laws and judgments given by God to Israel, as well as account of the purification of the people and the rebellion of Korah, who challenged the leadership of Moses and Aaron. These chapters deal with issues of purity, holiness, worship, and divine authority. God instructs Moses on the offerings that the people should bring to the Lord when they enter the promised land. God lays down detailed rules for how the grain, animal, and drink offerings should be made, depending on the circumstances and celebration. One of the most notable instructions in this chapter is a command to offer additional sacrifices along with the bread and drink for each offering made. In addition, if someone sins through ignorance, he must offer a sacrifice of atonement to purify himself. The offering of sacrifices for atonement and purification was central to maintaining the people's relationship with God, ensuring that holiness was preserved. God also establishes a punishment for those who violate these laws as a way of maintaining order and purity. However, The chapter ends with a reminder that keeping God's commandments is essential to the well-being of the entire community. Chapter 16 describes the great rebellion of Korah, Dathan, and Abiram, who challenged the authority of Moses and Aaron. Korah was a Levite, and Dathan and Abiram were from the tribe of Reuben. They gathered a group of 250 men of renown among the Israelites and opposed the leadership of Moses and Aaron, accusing them of exalting themselves too much over the congregation of the Lord. Korah and his followers questioned the legitimacy of Moses' leadership, claiming that everyone in the camp was holy and that Moses and Aaron should not set themselves above others. Moses, perplexed, prostrated himself before God, and then issued a challenge for Korah and his followers to offer incense before God the next day, along with Moses and Aaron, to see whom God would choose as his leader. The next morning, Korah and his followers did so, but God came through a dramatic punishment. The earth opened up and swallowed Korah, Dathan, Abiram, and their families alive, and fire consumed the 250 men who had offered the incense. This was a clear sign that God would not tolerate disobedience and defiance of his authority. Although the rebellion was dramatically suppressed, the people continued to grumble against Moses and Aaron, and God sent a plague that killed over 14,000 Israelites. To ward off evil, Moses commanded Aaron to offer incense, which stopped the spread of plague. This event highlights the seriousness of defying divine authority and the need to maintain God's order. To confirm Aaron's authority as high priest, God commands Moses to ask the leaders of each tribe to bring a staff with the name of the tribe written on it. Aaron, as a representative of the tribe of Levi, also presents a staff. The staffs are placed in the tent of meeting, and the Lord causes Aaron's staff to blossom and produce almonds. This miracle was a visible sign that Aaron had been chosen by God for priesthood, and not the rebels who had defied divine authority. Chapter 18 deals with the responsibilities of the priests and Levites in God's service. God establishes the specific roles of Aaron and his sons as priests, including caring for the tabernacle, administering the offerings, and mediating between God and the people. The Levites, in turn, are responsible for serving the priests and helping with the tasks related to the tabernacle. God also commands the people to contribute offerings to support the priests and Levites, since they do not have an inheritance in the land like the other tribes. In return, the priests and Levites are to ensure that the offerings and sacrifices are made properly, maintaining the sanctity of worship. This chapter 19 deals with the ceremonial purification required for those who have become unclean through contact with a dead body. Purification was accomplished through the sacrifice of a red cow, which was to be burned completely, and the resulting ashes were mixed with water to purify the Israelites. This ritual was of great importance in maintaining purity within the Israelite community, especially in a context where holiness was seen as essential to God's presence among the people. In chapters 15 through 19 of Numbers, the laws and judgments that are presented address issues essential to the religious and social life of the Israelites, such as the observance of sacrifices, the purification of the people, the authority of Moses and Aaron, and the consequences of rebellion against God. God's instructions are intended to preserve the holiness and purity of the community, while also establishing clear rules regarding leadership, worship, and the relationship between the people and God. The episode of Korah's rebellion is particularly significant, as it demonstrates the seriousness of challenging God's leadership and authority. And the miracle of Aaron's rod serves as divine confirmation of Aaron's selection as a priest. The law of the red heifer, in turn, highlights the importance of ceremonial purity in accessing God's presence. These chapters teach that obedience to God and respect for his commands are crucial to the life of the people of Israel, and that disobedience and rebellion have serious consequences. The journey into the wilderness, Numbers 20 and 21. The chapter begins with the death of Miriam, the sister of Moses and Aaron, at Kadesh in the desert of Zin. Miriam had been an important leader during the Exodus from Egypt and played a crucial role in the celebratory song after crossing the Red Sea, Exodus 15. Her death is a significant milestone, as she was one of the founding figures of the Israelite community. She was buried there, and her death caused great sadness among the people. After Miriam's death, the people of Israel continue their journey through the desert and, as on many other occasions, face a lack of water. The people begin to murmur against Moses and Aaron, saying that they would rather have died in Egypt than be in the desert without water. They question Moses' leadership and accuse him of bringing suffering and death to them and their livestock. God commands Moses to speak to the rock before the assembly, so that it will produce water. However, Moses, frustrated with the people, instead of speaking to the rock, strikes the rock twice with his staff. Water then gushed forth and quenched the people's thirst. But for their disobedience and lack of trust in God's instructions, Moses and Aaron are rebuked. God tells Moses that because he has not sanctified the name of the Lord before the people and has not completely obeyed his command, he will not enter the promised land. This failure of Moses, although not a major transgression, resulted in a serious consequence. He could not lead the people to Canaan. Later, in chapter 20, God instructs Moses to take Aaron and his son Eleazar to Mount Hor. There, Aaron dies and is succeeded by his son Eleazar as the high priest of Israel. The people deeply mourn the death of Aaron. He, like Miriam, was a central figure in the leadership of Israel. After Aaron's death, the people continue their journey, and a rebellion of the people of Israel continues. They begin to murmur again against God and Moses, lamenting the lack of bread and water, and expressing displeasure with the manna that God had provided. They complain that they would rather be in Egypt, where they had more variety of food, although they have forgotten the suffering and slavery. As a result of their rebellion, God sends fiery serpents, probably poisonous snakes, to attack the people. The serpents bite the Israelites, and many die. Faced with pain and suffering, the people repent and ask Moses to intercede for them. Moses prays to God for mercy. God then instructs Moses to make a bronze serpent and place it on a pole. Anyone bitten by the serpents should look at the bronze serpent and be healed. The bronze serpent is a symbol of healing and salvation, and many are healed when they obey this divine command. This event also has strong symbolism, as Jesus would later refer to it as a type of his own crucifixion, John 3:14 and 15, in which all who look to him, the lifted up one, would be saved. The death of Miriam and Aaron signals the end of the generation that was freed from Egypt and that led the people during their early years in the wilderness. The leadership of Moses and Aaron is coming to an end, and the people prepare for a new phase in their journey without these founding leaders. The incident of Moses striking the rock instead of speaking to it reveals that even great leaders can fail. Moses' punishment, not being allowed to enter the promised land, shows the seriousness of disobeying God, even in a moment of frustration. This event also teaches a need to trust God completely and follow his instructions precisely. The people's murmuring against God and subsequent punishment with fiery serpents show that disobedience and ingratitude toward God have serious consequences. However, the provision of a bronze serpent as a means of salvation reveals God's mercy and his willingness to offer forgiveness and healing to the repentant. These events highlight both the patience and justice of God, who, despite the people's repeated rebellion, still offers a chance for salvation and forgiveness. Balak and Balaam, Numbers 22 to 24. Chapter 22 begins with the story of how the people of Israel, after defeating the Amorites, arrive at the plains of Moab near the Jordan River in the Promised Land. The king of Moab, Balak, is deeply afraid when he sees a large number of Israelites and feels threatened. He knows that the Israelites are powerful and fears being defeated by them. Balak then decides to turn to the prophet Balaam, a man known for his ability to bless and curse, whose word would have great power. Balak sends messengers to Balaam, offering him a great reward if he curses Israel. Balaam, however, consults God before making any decision. God responds by saying that he should not go, because Israel is a blessed people, and no one can curse them. Therefore, Balaam refuses the messenger's offer. But Balak does not give up. He sends messengers again, this time with a more generous offer, asking Balaam to come and do what he wants. God, in his sovereignty, allows Balaam to go, but warns him to strictly obey his word and not deviate. So Balaam sets out for Moab, but during the journey, a remarkable event occurs. As Balaam travels to meet Balak, God sends an angel to block the path of his donkey. The donkey, sensing the presence of the angel, strays 3 times, and Balaam, in anger, strikes it. But then God opens the donkey's mouth, and it speaks to Balaam, asking why he is striking it. Surprised, Balaam then sees the angel of God, who is holding a sword in his hand, ready to kill him. The angel explains that he was preventing Balaam from following a path of disobedience. After being rebuked, Balaam repents and promises to obey God. This episode of the donkey speaks of how God can use unusual means to guide and correct his servants, also demonstrating his mercy and patience with those who, despite being stubborn, still had the opportunity to repent and follow the right path. Upon arriving in Moab, Balaam meets Balak, the Moabite king, and the two go to a high mountain with a privileged view from where they can see part of the camp of Israel. Balak asks Balaam to curse Israel there, but Balaam, after consulting God, says that he can only speak the words that God gives him. He then pronounces the first blessing on Israel, declaring that God considers them a blessed people and that no curse can prevail against them. Balak is furious because he expected a curse, but instead he hears a blessing. So he tries again, taking Balaam to another place where the view of Israel is different, in the hope that Balaam will curse the people again. But once again Balaam, upon consulting God, blesses Israel. He reaffirms that he cannot curse the people whom God has blessed, and that no witchcraft or enchantment can prevail against Israel. In chapter 24, Balak, frustrated, tries one last time to take Balaam to a higher vantage point where he can see the people of Israel from a different perspective. However, as Balaam looks down upon the people, he is seized by the Spirit of God, and instead of cursing, he once again prophesies the blessing of Israel. Balaam declares that Israel is a powerful and blessed nation with a glorious future. He prophesies that although other nations try to oppose Israel, they will not succeed. He also makes a messianic prophecy, mentioning a star that will rise out of Jacob, Israel, which is generally interpreted as a reference to the future Messiah. After this, Balaam withdraws from Moab, leaving Balak furious and having achieved nothing. The story ends with a statement that Balaam, despite his prophetic ability, ended up leaving for his homeland and died tragically later. In chapter 31, it is mentioned that he was killed by the Israelites. The episode of Balak and Balaam contains several profound lessons. The sovereignty of God. Even when Israel's enemies tried to curse them, God demonstrated that no one can resist his divine plan. He used Balaam, a prophet, to pronounce blessings upon Israel, demonstrating that God is in control of all circumstances. The power of words. Although Balaam was a prophet hired to curse Israel, his words could only be those that God allowed. This reminds us of the power of God's word and how, no matter how much we try to change God's plans, God's will always prevail. Faithfulness to God. Even in the face of great rewards and pressures, Balaam knew that he had to follow God's instructions. However, his story also serves as a warning about the corruption of his intentions, because although he obeyed God, he ended up being carried away by greed and the attempt to obtain more benefits, as we will see in other texts, Revelation 2 verse 14. The Messianic prophecy. Balaam's prophecy about the star that would rise from Jacob is seen as a reference to the Messiah, Jesus Christ, who would come to bring salvation not only to Israel, but to all nations. The sin at Peor and the second generation, Numbers 25 to 27. This chapter describes one of the most serious moments of Israel's sin in the desert, which occurs at Peor, an area in the plains of Moab, while the Israelites are still traveling. The people of Israel begin to associate with Moabite women and, in an act of idolatry and sexual immorality, participate in the festivals of Baal of Peor, a pagan god worshipped by the Moabites. The Moabite women encourage the Israelites to sacrifice to pagan gods and to engage in immoral acts. This collective sin is a major transgression against God's law, which forbade any form of idolatry and moral corruption. God is angry with Israel for their unfaithfulness and for straying from his covenant. He orders the leaders of the people to be punished, and a plague spreads rapidly among the Israelites, killing thousands. The sin of idolatry and immorality not only dishonors God, but also has direct consequences for the people. However, an act of zeal for God's holiness occurs when Phinehas, the son of the priest Eleazar, sees an Israelite and a Midianite woman committing an immoral act in public. Phinehas, in an impulsive but zealous act for God's holiness, kills both with a spear, stopping the action and putting an end to the spread of sin. God then commends Phinehas for his action, saying that he has calmed his wrath against the Israelites, and the plague is stopped. God's reward for Phinehas is a covenant of peace with him and his descendants, promising him an eternal priesthood because of his righteous and zealous attitude. As a consequence of the sins committed at Peor, God commands the Israelites to defeat the Midianites, who had incited the sin, and to destroy their idolatry. This command results in a war against the Midianites, which will later become a focus of revenge to purify Israel. After the terrible episode at Peor and the punishment imposed by God, a new count of the people of Israel is carried out, known as the Census of the Second Generation. The purpose of this census is to count the surviving Israelites, since the original generation that left Egypt, due to disobedience and sin, would not enter the Promised Land. The census records the men of each tribe who are able to go to war. Although the previous generation failed to obey God and was punished, the new generation that emerges is more committed to the Lord and ready to face the challenges of taking the Promised Land. The census also serves to determine inheritances and organize the tribes. Among the tribes, there is a great variation in the number of people, with some tribes growing significantly, while others shrink due to divine punishment. The tribes of Judah and Ephraim are the largest, and the tribe of Reuben is the first to be recorded. An important point in chapter 26 is the case of the daughters of Zelophehad, who had no brothers. They presented themselves to Moses and asked that their father's inheritance be passed on to them, since he had no sons. In a groundbreaking decision, God approves the transfer of inheritance to daughters, allowing them to have a claim to their father's inheritance. This marks an important moment of justice and equity in the Old Testament, as it establishes a basis for women to also receive inheritance. This chapter deals with the transition of leadership from Moses to Joshua, who will be the leader who will lead the people in conquering the Promised Land. Moses, although a faithful leader, was told by God that he would not enter the Promised Land because of his disobedience, reported earlier when he struck the rock instead of speaking to it. However, God instructs Moses to designate Joshua, son of Nun, as a successor. Joshua is chosen to lead the people on their final journey to conquer the land. Moses, recognizing the importance of Joshua's role, prays to God to raise up a strong leader for Israel who can lead them with wisdom and courage. God responds in the affirmative and instructs Moses to lay his hands on Joshua, transferring to him the authority to lead the people. Joshua is publicly commissioned in the presence of the priest Eleazar and the people. The appointment of Joshua, along with Moses' command not to enter the Promised Land, marks the end of Moses' ministry as leader of Israel. The transition of leadership is done carefully and respectfully, ensuring that the people have the continuity they need to conquer the land. In chapters 25 through 27 of Numbers, we see the transition from a generation that was lost in sin to a new generation ready to inherit God's promise. The story of Peor and Israel's idolatry serves as a warning about the consequences of sin, but also about God's mercy and patience, who, upon seeing the people's repentance, offers forgiveness and restoration. The new generation, which undergoes the census, is prepared to enter the Promised Land, with Joshua as the chosen leader to guide them. God, despite the disobedience and failures of the previous generation, continues to fulfill his promises, raising up a new generation of Israelites willing to follow his commandments. This points to God's grace in giving new opportunities and showing his faithfulness, even when the people fail. The second census and final instructions, Numbers 26 to 36. This chapter presents the second census of the Israelites, taken before entering the Promised Land, to count the new generation of people who survived the desert and who will be ready to fight for the conquest of Canaan. The census is taken to establish the number of men fit for war, which will be essential for the distribution of the lands of Canaan among the tribes of Israel. This census has an organizational character, as it prepares the people for the battles that will follow. Furthermore, it serves to determine the divisions of the tribes and ensure that inheritances are properly distributed. After the census, we see that some tribes have increased in number, while others have decreased due to the death of the previous generation in the wilderness. Judah, for example, is the largest tribe, reflecting its prominence in the leadership of Israel. The chapter also includes account of the tribes and the lineages, including details about the families of each tribe. A significant development in the census is the inclusion of the daughters of Zelophehad, who, as mentioned earlier, had claimed the right to their father's inheritance since he had no sons. God approves this claim, granting women the right to receive inheritances, which is a significant innovation in Israel's legal system. This chapter 27, includes the designation of Joshua as the new leader of Israel, who will replace Moses in leading the people into the Promised Land. God instructs Moses to climb Mount Abarim, from where he'll be able to see the promised land, but not to enter it because of his previous disobedience. Moses asks God to choose a leader who can lead the people after him, and God appoints Joshua, son of Nun. Joshua is publicly commissioned by Moses, who lays his hands on him in front of the people and the priest Eleazar. This action symbolizes a transfer of authority from Moses to Joshua. The chapter also reinforces the instructions given earlier about inheritance, addressing the issue of women's right to inheritance, especially in the case of family without sons. This reflects God's concern for justice and the equitable distribution of land among the Israelites. These chapters, 28 and 29, contain detailed instructions about the daily sacrifices and religious festivals that Israel was to observe. The laws regarding sacrifices are reiterated to ensure that the worship of God is properly maintained, with offerings daily and during annual festivals such as Passover and the Feast of Weeks. In chapter 30, laws are established regarding the vows and promises that the Israelites make to God. The chapter deals specifically with the responsibility of men and women regarding vows, with rules that are intended to protect women, especially young women and wives, in cases where their fathers or husbands have annulled their vows. The laws seek to ensure that vows are fulfilled according to God's will and in a just manner. Next, God commands Moses to avenge Israel against the Midianites, who were responsible for the people's temptation and sin at Peor. Israel defeats the Midianites in battle, and the victory serves as a judgment against idolatry and immorality. After the victory, Moses gives instructions on what to do with the spoils of war, such as dividing the goods and purifying the people who participated in the battle. Two tribes, Reuben and Gad, request permission to settle on lands east of the Jordan and Gilead, even before the total conquest of Canaan. They justify their request by the fertility of the land, but promise to help the other tribes in the conquest of Canaan. Moses approves of this proposal, provided that they fulfill their part in the fight for the land promised to the other Israelites. This chapter, chapter 33, provides a detailed account of the stations of Israel's journey from their departure from Egypt to the plains of Moab, where they now stand on the edge of the promised land. Each stop is recorded, and the chapter also describes God's command that the land of Canaan be taken into possession, with the destruction of the idolatrous nations that inhabit it. God gives precise instructions about the boundaries of the promised land and how the land will be divided among the tribes of Israel. Distribution will be done by lot, and it is established that Eleazar the high priest and Joshua, the military leader, will have the authority to oversee the distribution process. This chapter clearly establishes the parameters of possession and the responsibilities of each tribe. Here in chapter 35, God gives instructions about cities of refuge, where someone who has committed accidental homicide can take refuge to avoid the vengeance of the victim's relative. Cities of refuge are a mechanism of justice to ensure that accidental deaths do not lead to an endless cycle of revenge. The chapter also contains laws about deliberate murder, which should be punishable by death, and about the procedure for ensuring justice in cases of homicide. At the end of the book of Numbers, the daughters of Zelophehad, who had claimed the right to their father's inheritance, question what will happen to their inheritance if they marry men from other tribes. God, through Moses, resolves that they must marry men from their own tribe, so that their father's inheritance will remain within the tribe of Manasseh. This reinforces the laws of inheritance and the protection of each tribe's genealogical line. So, what did you think of the lessons from Numbers so far? The journey of the people of Israel is far from over, and we have much more to explore together. Leave your comment, share your opinion, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next videos. Stay tuned, because the discoveries are just beginning. See you in the next video.